Helen's right. We do have this kind of laser focus. After this summer, we're going to be celebrating our 30th anniversary of our ordination. So we will have been doing this co-pastor business for 30 years. And it's kind of like, at this point, we just sort of read each other's minds. The only problem is my mind is usually just a pot of mush. And she has difficulty knowing exactly what I'm trying to communicate. But I had asked her to read the Corinthians passage before I read the Old Testament passage this morning. One of the other things that happened during this past couple of weeks while we were at Montreat is we managed to both get colds and then pass them around back and forth to each other. I was so excited when Helen came up the second week after being away the first week. The first thing I did was pass my cold on to her. And so she was grateful for that and has been especially appreciative over the past few days. But you may just want to fist bump both of us as you're going out of church this morning rather than shaking hands. Our Old Testament lesson is from the book of Samuel, first book of Samuel, chapter 15, verse 34, and into chapter 16, verse 13. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king of Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said to them, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's never easy when two strong leaders who have been so effective in leading or governing or working together, it's never easy when they part company on bad terms. Disagreements, misunderstandings, sensitive egos, struggles for power, They can ruin what had been productive and good relationships and just leave division and distrust in their wake. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were both native sons of Virginia. They were co-patriots and leaders in the Revolution and the formation of a new country. But during Washington's second administration, they had a brutal falling out. It had something to do with the young government's relationship with the government of France, Jefferson's relationships there having been there, and Washington's hesitancy. But in the midst of those growing disagreements, Jefferson began to write pamphlets and say things about Washington that weren't always complimentary, and even sometimes he wrote in an anonymous name. He even got to the point of where some of these writings questioned Washington's competency, and nobody questioned Washington's competency. Washington was a man of great pride. And when he found out, as what eventually always happens, it comes out, when he found out that it was Jefferson who was writing these things, he felt a deep personal betrayal, and he refused to ever speak to Jefferson again. Martha Washington declared that Jefferson, who had been a frequent visitor in their home at Mount Vernon, was never to be allowed to set foot at Mount Vernon again. Their former relationship, the relationship between Jefferson and Washington, was never fully restored. It isn't easy, is it, when two strong leaders part on bad terms? The beginning of the text which we read from this story in 1 Samuel has us at that place where two strong leaders, two important leaders in the history of Israel have parted on bad terms. It read, Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. Do you remember what has happened to bring us to this point? Well, once again, two strong leaders have ended up at odds and in disagreement. It's a wonderful set of stories, so important to Israel's identity and self-understanding and history. It goes back. You have to remember when Samuel, who was a prophet and a judge over Israel, you may remember when he had gotten old, and after leading for many, many years, he started to put his sons who had become judges in his place and transfer some of his power and authority over them. But his sons were really nothing quite like Samuel. They were dishonest, and they took bribes, and they perverted justice, until the point where the people of Israel gathered and they said to Samuel, we want a king over Israel, just like all the other nations have. Give us a king to govern us. We're fed up with this loose affiliation of judges. We want to be like the other countries. Remember how God told Samuel, you have to listen to the people. Remember, Samuel, it isn't that the people have rejected you from being judge over them, but they've rejected God from being king over them. The people have rejected me from being Lord of Israel. Remember how Samuel tried to warn the people about the dangers of having a king. They'd never had a king before. And Samuel told the people, you got to be careful about these people who think they should be king, the people that you end up making as king. They'll conscript your sons into the army, and they'll take your fields and your orchards and your vineyards. They're going to take your daughters, and they're going to make them bakers and cooks and perfumers. They're going to tax you solely for the benefit of the officers of their armory and to give money to the courtiers surrounding them. The king will take your slaves. The king's going to take your best cattle and your best donkey. You should really think twice. You should really think 3 times, 4 times, 5 times about this idea of having a king. And finally, when you get fed up with this king that you may want to have now, and when you cry out to God because of what the king's doing, you know what's going to happen? Samuel told the people, God won't even answer you. But even with all that warning, the people said, no, we want a king. And so God said to Samuel, listen to the people. and give them what they want. Set a king over them. And then we're told about this young man named Saul. He came from a wealthy family, from the tribe of Benjamin. And the Bible describes him. Can you imagine the Bible saying about someone, but this is what it says about Saul. He was the most handsome man in all of Israel. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. If you were casting somebody in Hollywood to play the role of a king, the first king, Saul would be the one you would want to cast. Saul had been sent on a journey to look for his father's donkeys that had wandered away. And while Saul, an assistant, went looking for these donkeys, he ran into this old prophet Samuel, who was on his way to sacrifice at the shrine at the land of Zuph. God had already told Samuel that Saul was to be the one who would be set over Israel as king. Saul was to be the one he was going to anoint. So Samuel invited Saul, come with me up to the shrine and let us sacrifice there together. And then as they're at the shrine, and then as they have a big meal together afterwards with Saul, not really sure what all is going on and why it is that he finds himself in the company of this old prophet, Samuel says to him, Saul, you are the one on whom Israel's desire is set. If not you, Saul, then who else could it be? Saul is confused and he protests to Samuel, I'm nobody. What are you talking about? I'm from the humblest of families, which isn't exactly true, but Saul never seemed to have a really secure self-image of himself. He was always struggling with this. But nevertheless, after this meal, Samuel, the one who anoints people on God's behalf, anoints Saul with oil, and he kisses him and he tells him God has appointed Saul as the ruler over God's people, Israel. And then Samuel prophesies to Saul all these things which will happen to him in the future, in the days ahead, which will confirm for him that he is the one God has chosen. And all these things will culminate in the Spirit of God coming upon Saul until he finds himself in a prophetic frenzy, just like the other prophets. These are going to be signs to Saul that he is indeed the one that God has chosen. And then as Saul is leaving Samuel, the Bible says that God gave Saul a new heart. The Bible says the Spirit came upon Saul and he was changed into a different person. And this is so significant because here this first king, even though he may look like a king, being so handsome, being so tall, something isn't altogether there. It's the Lord's Spirit which has to come upon him and transform him in his heart into the kind of person that really needs to be king. All these signs take place. All these events are performed and confirmed, and Samuel gathers all of the people together to present to them their new king, Saul. And do you remember what Saul did at that point? He burrowed down under all the baggage that had been gathered by all the people, and he hid from this. He didn't want to have to face this. He didn't want to have to stand before all the people as the one who was appointed to be king, but they found him and they put him and brought him forward, and Samuel said, "Do you see now the one the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him in all of Israel." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul with power, and it was the Spirit to guide him, the Spirit to embolden him, the Spirit to give him courage, the Spirit to lead him forth into battle. And emboldened and empowered and consumed by the Spirit of God, Saul was an effective leader at first, and he was successful, winning many victories against Israelites' enemies. As long as the Spirit of God was upon him, Saul was winning, and as long as he was winning, he was good in the eyes of all the people. Samuel described, and he said to everybody what the terms of this kingship were going to be. As long as the king and as long as the people followed the commands of the Lord, all would go well. But if at any moment the people start to rebel against the king, and if at any moment the king no longer follows the commands of the Lord, then things will start to turn, and it will go bad. It will go bad. At one point, as the Israelites were in a fight against the Philistines, one of their constant enemies. Remember, Goliath was a Philistine, and David fought Goliath. But before that, while they were also fighting the Philistines, Saul got very anxious about the battle that he was going to lead his people out into, and he kept calling for Samuel. Have Samuel come and conduct a sacrifice to God so it will go well with us. Have Samuel come. But Samuel didn't make it in time, and Saul got so anxious that he went ahead and conducted the sacrifice for himself. He took on the role of the prophet, the king, becoming the prophet too. And when Samuel got there, he said, Saul, what in the world have you done? You've gone against God's command. How in the world could you do this? And suddenly Samuel found himself saying to Saul, the one on whom he had poured God's oil, the Lord is going to start to look for somebody new. The Lord is going to start to look for someone with a heart after God's own heart. And this from now on will be the one on whom the Lord will pour out his Spirit. This will be the one on whom the Lord will set as king over Israel. And so you begin to see the shift in this story of Saul and Samuel, where the weaknesses and the flaws of Saul begin to come forward, and Saul begins to rely on other things, and Saul begins to turn to himself, and Saul begins to fail to follow closely what God has commanded, and the division begins, and the rift grows, and the turning begins to slowly happen, where Saul begins to fall out of favor, and he becomes a king, almost just in name only, no longer with the power of the Lord upon him. Finally, it comes to the point where the Israelites find themselves preparing to engage in battle against the Amalekites, and the Lord, still guiding Saul, gives specific instructions through Samuel that in the midst of this battle, all of the Amalekites are to be destroyed. Nothing should be left. And the battle ensues, and the Amalekites are destroyed, except that Saul preserves the king of the Amalekites, Agag, and he preserves the best of the spoils taken from the Amalekites and lets them be for his officers and the leading people in his armies. And when God sees that, when God sees finally there Saul's failure to follow his commandments, God says, I regret that I've made Saul king, because he has turned his back from following me and has not followed my commands. God says, I'm sorry that I made God king. This is only the second time in the Old Testament where God says he regrets something, where God says he's sorry about something. Do you remember the other time? It's the story of the flood. And right at the beginning of that story, when God observes all of the evil and wickedness of humanity, God says to God's self, I regret, I'm sorry that I've made humanity. I've got to find a new way to start over again. But here, when God finds himself sorry about Saul being king, God sends Samuel again to Saul. And when Samuel gets there, he finds that Saul has set up a monument to himself. He goes and he says to Saul, Saul, what have you done? And Saul announces to Samuel, I followed the commands of the Lord. And then Samuel says, well, what do I hear bleating in the distance? Aren't those the sound of sheep? And aren't those cattle mooing that I hear? And Samuel then makes up this story. Oh, we had to keep those. We let them keep those so that they would have something to sacrifice to the Lord. This will be a sacrifice to the Lord. And Samuel says to Saul, let me tell you what the Lord has to say. And Saul says, speak. What does the Lord have to say? And Samuel says, Saul, I know that you are small in your own eyes, but are you not head over all the tribes of Israel? You have such a little view of yourself, even after what God has put you in the midst of, that it's come to this? So Saul and Samuel, they argue, Saul saying, but I've only done this to make a sacrifice to God for the people of Israel. And Samuel saying, you just don't get it. Don't you? Isn't obedience better than sacrifice? Because you have rejected the word of the Lord. He has rejected you from being the king of Israel. And then we have this poignant scene, which happens right before we're told about the division, which happens right before we're told that Samuel went to Ramah and Saul went to his house in Gibeah. We're told that after Samuel and Saul had fought and argued, and after Samuel said to Saul, you just don't get it, Samuel turned to go away, and Saul reached out and caught the hem of his robe, and he tore Samuel's robe. And Samuel said to him again, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this very day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Moreover, the glory of Israel will not recant or change his mind, for he is not a mortal that he can change his mind. And Saul said, Samuel, I've sinned. But stay with me, honor me once more before the people of Israel, before the elders. Go back with me so that I should worship the Lord your God. And Samuel relents and goes back with Saul and leads worship once more. But the die has already been cast. Samuel goes to Ramah, and Saul goes to his home in the house of Gibeah. And Samuel no longer sees Saul until the day of his death. God regrets, and God is sorry, and Samuel grieves. Have you ever felt grief like that? Certainly we know grief at the death of a loved one, that kind of sadness, absence. But there's also a kind of grief, isn't there, around those things in life that just don't turn out like we expected them to. A kind of grief around those things that seem to represent failures to us. A kind of sadness and frustration about what we don't know will come next and whether or not we think anything will come next. Have you ever known that kind of grief? Grief that just kind of immobilizes you. Grief that just makes you sit down and stare at the wall and not feel like getting up at all. And then the word of the Lord came to Samuel and said, fill your horn with oil. Do what? I imagine Samuel said, thanks, but no thanks. I did that once already. I'm not interested. Get somebody else. I'm not your man. Fill your horn with oil. Why? Look the way it ends up. Failure, brokenness, division, misunderstanding, a crazy king. Fill your horn with oil. That's God's promise that something new is going to happen, that God is going to do something new. Fill your horn with oil. Surely there have been moments in your life, times, haven't there been, when the word of the Lord comes to you and you just feel like saying, never mind, not interested, doesn't matter. I'm tired. I'm old. I've done it before. Won't make a difference. Get somebody else. Fill your horn with oil. I have a new idea in mind, the Lord says. There's somebody new. Somebody I'm sending you to anoint. Somebody I'm sending you to find. Somebody I'm sending you to encourage. Somebody I'm sending you to help. Something I'm sending you to do. Yes, you've done it before, and I'm telling you to do it again. Fill your horn with oil. Get up now. How long are you going to grieve over Saul? Quit staring at the wall. Get up. Get up. Fill your horn with oil. Happens in the Bible in lots of different ways all the time, especially in the New Testament. Jesus comes up on some fishermen who've been fishing all night. They can't catch a thing. After fishing all night, they're on the shore there, working their nets, frustrated, tired, worn out, beat up. And Jesus comes up and says to them, what have you been doing fishing all night? Well, maybe you should get out there and fish some more. There aren't any more fish out there. No, go back on out there and fish some more. Throw your nets over on the other side. Well, we've been fishing all. Do it again. Fill your horn with oil. Cast your nets out onto the other side. Look, it won't matter, but at your word, okay. And they pull up more fish than they could ever imagine. Remember that time Jesus learned that his friend Lazarus was sick? And Jesus said to his disciples, we need to go. Lazarus is sick and needs our help. And his disciples said, no, we can't go there. They're waiting there to kill us. Lazarus is already dead. Why bother? No, we don't. Let's not go there. And Jesus said, no, let's go. We have to go to Lazarus. Lazarus needs our help. And the disciples say, okay, if it means we'll all die, we're going with you. Remember that time God sent a word to Cornelius and said, there's a fellow named Saul. He's coming to see you. Well, thanks, but no thanks. I have no desire to meet this Saul. He's been killing Christians. No, I'm sending him to you anyway. Fill your horn with oil. There's a word of grace for us here. Sometimes I think grace means we just have to take a deep breath and trust that God knows what God is doing. Get back up and try again. Try again to see if grace, like a mustard seed, can't grow into a great bush. Try again and see if grace can't open our eyes and begin to see people and things in a new way like we've never seen them before. As Paul said, we always looked at them from a human point of view, but now we see something different. Since one have died and all have died for Christ, now we see them in an entirely different way. Behold, anyone in Christ is a new creation. Fill your horn with oil. Start looking at the people around you. Start looking at the world around you through my eyes. Start trying again on the terms that I'm going to give you, because I don't look at things like you do. I don't look on people like you do. Let all these brothers go by. There's one more brother that I don't think you've seen yet. He's out there watching the sheep. Fill your horn with oil. Sometimes grace means we're just going to do it again. Vacation Bible school? Oh my goodness. Again? Decorating again? All those kids here again? I'm tired. I'm worn out. I'm not sure it makes it. Fill your horn with oil. Children's Sunday school class up there. One mother teaching her daughters week after week after week. Somebody needs to hear the word of the Lord say, fill your horn with oil, and go help her with the expectancy that there'll be more children to come. Fill your horn with oil. Empty pews? Start to look at this in a new way. Fill your horn with oil. I have a picture in our house that my dad gave me a number of years ago. He gave it to all the brothers and our sister as well. It's a picture of the DeBevoise dairy cart. My family, the DeBevoise family, had a dairy farm in Jacksonville in the early 1900s. And this picture shows a dairy cart that says DeBevoise Dairy, and one of my great uncles is there driving the cart, and next to him is obviously one of the workers probably on the dairy, helpers. He's an African American standing there. And I've always admired that. See, that's the DeBevoise Dairy, Jacksonville, early 1900s. That's where I come from. That's my line of folks. I'm a dairyman by heart. Right there, see? It's important to know your family, isn't it? I like showing people that picture. This week at the Montreat Youth Conference, we celebrated as the hymn of the conference, the hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing. We're going to sing it at the conclusion of the service in just a minute. Lift every voice and sing. Lift Every Voice and Sing was a poem written by the African poet and at that time principal of Stanton Elementary School in Jacksonville, Florida. Written in that year of 1900, for a celebration of Abraham Lincoln's 50th birthday, written and read by 500 African American school children in Jacksonville, Florida. Lift every voice and sing until heaven rings with the sounds of liberty and righteousness. They were reciting that poem to Booker T. Washington, who had come for the celebration there at Stanton Elementary. And as we were learning about the history of that song, about the experience of the African American people and how this song has become to them a national anthem, how it was written and how they were expressing their journey and claiming their identity right in the midst of Jim Crow arising at the same time and segregation beginning to put its claws back into the community, all of a sudden I began to see that picture of the DeBevoise dairy cart and my family there, probably not more than a couple of miles from that elementary school where that song was being sung and that poem being recited. I began to see it in a new way and wondered about just what was my family doing and just who was that man standing next to the dairy cart and how was he being treated by my family. And I began to think about that as my story, began to see it in the new ways, and I began to remember the ways that my dad in his early ministry worked with Washington Shores Presbyterian Church here in Orlando, began to build bridges and began to come together around the rights of people and the stories of people. And I began to see that story in a whole new way and whole new eyes, looking at it not to claim my family's identity, but to understand the story of who I am in the context and in the interweaving of the story of who all God's people are. And experience the call to live in the light of that and to hear those voices being lifted up. Fill your horn with oil. Something new may be about to happen. God may indeed be doing a new thing. Amen.